So hello everybody, my name's Cameron Casoglis with the Sport Coaching Leadership Program at Drexel University, and I am thrilled to welcome you all to tonight's webinar with Karen Freeman. We're going to be diving into this topic of the nutrition and meal reset, or rituals of reset, as we refuel for fitness in this new period of lockdown that we're all experiencing. Karen is a wealth of knowledge, one of our faculty members with the Sport Coaching Leadership Program, and has a wealth of experience not only at the collegiate level, but also with some of the professional football teams in the Southern California region. And hopefully you all received the handout, the PDF that I sent out just before this webinar began, that Karen was gracious enough to share with us, talking about nutrition strategies during this period of lockdown. And Karen and I were talking a couple of weeks ago just about the routines that we've all embarked on, some of them healthy, some of them perhaps the long commute to the front door for me goes past the fridge door. So I'm constantly having that battle, that negotiation. But in that handout, I learned a new term that the acronym NEAT is a scientific term for non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And so Karen, I'll start off just by welcoming you and saying thank you very much for your time, and appreciate all that you're going to share with us.
Thank you, Cam. Can you hear me? Shall I share my screen?
Yeah, I'll just turn my screen off, and you can dive in there. So if anyone did not get that handout, if you want to email me, I'll be happy to share that with you. So.
Okay.
So yeah, Karen, and your slides are up to go. So.
Okay, good. Thank you for that introduction. Cam, you and I were speaking earlier just before the presentation about how you thoroughly mastered NEAT, the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, this weekend. And I wanted you to just kind of start us off with a little bit of information on what you dove into this weekend.
Sure. Full disclosure to everybody that doesn't know, I have an acre of property and 3 horses, some chickens, some goats, and in Southern California, I know to all you East Coasters will say boo-hoo, but we had quite a lot of rain over the last couple of weeks, and I've been dealing with the joys of digging some trenches to deal with some flooding. And so I spent 12 hours on Saturday and close to 14 hours on Sunday digging a 130-foot trench, sort of 3 inches by 9 inches to lay a pipe. And so I guess that was my workout for the week, Karen. But my back is certainly letting me know about it this morning.
Well, I think that goes beyond what we're going to be speaking about, but that was a wonderful example about what we do outside of our training to keep our lives in place. And now that we're in place, we really do have an opportunity to take on some of these tasks of everyday living that we tend to not take on because we're so busy in our work world and our training world. So I just wanted to go through a little bit more about NEAT and how we can use it to our advantage during this time. And no, we don't have to do what Cam did by digging for 14 hours. Just saying. Okay, so for the next slide, this is a slide that was presented actually just a couple of days ago by a sports scientist from France, and I'm going to blow his name if I say it, but I'll try, Yann Lamour. And he basically emphasized what, in this infographic, what NEAT is, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, where we vacuum, we dust, we do calisthenics, and also things like, instead of sitting in front of the TV and using remote, we're using incidental energy, again, NEAT, if we can get up and change the channel and kind of make it a habit to get up every 30 minutes or so, just to do things that we wouldn't normally do. So that's what other ways we deal with NEAT of people who, can't sit still. And when you're sitting down, you don't just lie down, you sit up straight, you hold your core. And also eating is actually, chewing your food is actually a thermogenic energy expenditure, which we'll get into. Okay, so just furthering, some other examples of non-activity non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Here is an example of fuel burned during a 30-minute session of doing something for a 155-pound person. And you can see, of course, when we're training, running, we're going to burn more fuel. And what you see highlighted in pink is some of the other activities we do throughout the day. And if we're stuck at home more and we're doing the highlighted pink activities, that's the additional 500 calories we might normally burn running around, getting in our car, going to our different activities throughout the day. So here is a ploy to really, kick in keeping the house clean. You don't have to dig up trenches for 14 hours. Just pick up the vacuum, right? Okay, so how is this different? And why is it important that we do more thought out daily activity at home? Well, we know for athletes, the guidelines for sports nutrition are pretty clear, and we've implemented them over the decades, and they haven't really changed that much. And this is from Louise Burke's work. But we know for athletes engaging in exercise, like to even moderate just 1 hour a day, this is the grams of carbohydrates per kilogram of body weight required. Are you able to see my pointer as I go through this, or are you able to see a pointer as I go through the slides, or no? Okay, so we can see that for somebody engaging in light to moderate activity, their carbohydrate or fueling needs on top of other needs, but this is our example that we're going to use to see how we can use NEAT, the non-exercise energy thermogenesis, to our advantage beyond sports. So I just want to go through this quickly. So an athlete training for an hour a day is going to need between 3 and 5 grams and up to 7 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. And what that translates into is several servings of grains, 12 a day, several servings of fruit, 12 a day, vegetables, and milk and yogurt. So how that translates into food is quite a large volume. Oops, sorry about that. Which is why athletes can't possibly have 12 bananas in a day and get out and train. But now that we're sitting at home, we actually can sit down and chew our food. And the reason there's an advantage to that is because when we peel the banana or the orange and have 12 whole fruits, we're burning energy in the peeling process, in the chewing process, and in the eating process, where normally we would get most of these fruits in a smoothie because we just don't have the time or the stomach volume to tolerate that massive amount of food. So athletes will generally go to snacks, smoothies, processed food to meet their fuel needs in sport. And I know one of the questions was, what's the best fuel to have before sport or after sport? And I'll just answer that real quickly. The fuel to have before sport is one that's easily digestible, like a glass of juice, and say cereal with milk at least an hour before to 2 hours before. And ideally, you're having a replenishing whole meal with more protein post-event, which we can get into with questions later. But for our purposes today, I really wanted to just emphasize how these are the foods, these liquid meals and these processed foods and packages are the ones that we go to in sport world to meet our fuel needs because we don't have chew time. But now we have chew time. So how does that change things? Well, we know, and this is a study done by Kevin Hall at the NIH. He's done some incredible work. This was published in Cell Metabolism. And what he showed, when you put patients in an inpatient facility or a controlled environment, which is different than an athlete environment, but it still tells us a whole lot about how humans choose food and how calorically dense, well, let's just go into the study. Basically what he did was take 12 inpatients for 2 weeks in the hospital setting, controlled environment, and they were allowed to eat ad lib as much food as they wanted, but one group got ultra processed food and the other group got an unprocessed diet. And then after 2 weeks, we looked to see what happened. He looked to see what happened to these patients' weight and if there was any difference. And lo and behold, the ultra processed group actually ended up eating 500 calories more per day compared to the unprocessed or whole food diet. And that goes back to this example. This is an ultra processed food, even though it's a healthy food, having juices and bars, whereas an unprocessed diet would be the oranges and the vegetables. So what ended up happening visually, you can see here, the ultra-processed diet was the blue line, and the unprocessed diet's the red line. And after 2 weeks, the ultra-processed diet group actually gained a whole kilo or 2 pounds. And the unprocessed diet compensated for the fuel that they were eating and their lower energy expenditure, and actually had no weight gain and potential loss and some loss. So we can see here, when we're in a sedentary environment like a hospital setting, and in a way like the setting we're in now, we will actually eat less if we just ad lib and instinctively eat what's in front of us. Our fuel intake will actually drop. So for athletes, this is a good compromise, whereby the sport performance fuel would probably be the same in terms of everyday diet. But when we're replenishing, because we're not doing tasks of everyday living as we used to, we want to integrate more whole foods because we now have more time to chew it. That said, carbohydrates, or let's just say oranges, should be peeled and chewed as opposed to made into orange juice. Which now takes us to how we eat today, and how, if there's a silver lining in this COVID environment, it's that it really is changing how we eat now. And this book, written by B. Wilson, The Way We Eat Now, she outlines how our relationship with food has gone wrong with the fast food nation that the US is, and really around the world, and has really promoted eating behavior like we're starting to have to engage in during this stay in place lifestyle that we have to endure during this pandemic. Anyway, B. Wilson is a food writer and a food historian, and has written several books and actually writes a monthly column on the Wall Street Journal, and she lives in Cambridge, England. And she eloquently writes in this recent book that the time budget affects how we eat. And the less time we have, the more quickly we eat. The food choices we tend to make are more processed and easy to eat and convenient and in packages. And the venues that we eat these foods in is actually less dignified, as you can see in this picture illustrated on the right. The quick fast foods standing or sitting in front of your computer or on the run or in your car. The less time we have, the more instinctively motivated we are to buy larger quantities of food when we can actually find the time to buy the food. And because who knows when we're going to have the time to get food again. And that's that hurry up and wait and mentality that we've all been living in really around the world. So again, the silver lining in this worldwide pandemic is that we are given a greater time budget here to refine our palate and add a little bit more dignity to our mealtime experiences. So in doing so, instinctively, we might be motivated to eat what we need instead of what time crunches demand, and eat less processed food and eat more whole foods, which is actually more fortified with nutrients and phytochemicals. And if we're looking at what's the best foods for immunity, it's your whole grains, fruits, and vegetables. And whole is the descriptive word, meaning the wholer the food, the more phytochemicals and antioxidants exist in that food. So even though smoothies are really healthy, if you blend it, the fruits and vegetables in a smoothie, you actually lose some of that immunity in the antioxidant and phytochemicals that are inherently in the whole food and are lost in the blending. Okay. Additionally, B. Wilson writes in this book an example of how the food revolution that we live in today has transformed our lives and our bodies and in our world. So what she used was an example in London in 2008. The average BMI, body mass index, for nurses was 27.2, which is somewhere between overweight and obese. How might these professional healthcare workers who know how to eat not do so? Well, their work demands and their routines and their schedules require that they place their patients' needs above their own. And they make this makes eating decent meals pretty much all but impossible. So the synchronized time to eat is lacking in this profession, and of course in many others, as we no longer have a community mealtime or shared mealtime to establish a scheduled way of eating until now. So how can we bring this back, and how can we start fortifying our diets with whole foods? And in doing so, burn more heat energy in the thermogenic effect of digestion. Get back into the food ritual routine and feel more comfortable and instinctively more comfortable in eating good whole foods. And what foods are they? And there is an infographic here, again, by the same researcher, and we lost his name on this one, really kind of showing what foods are best to buy during this quarantine. And he's recommending as well the whole grains, fruits and vegetables, milk, fish, beans, rice, and whole grains. And in this infomercial, it's not a commercial, what he's suggesting is when one does go shopping, make a plan and take what you need. Be strategic with the ingredients and prioritize produce first. Prepare your foods at home. Be aware of the portion sizes. One question we got early on that Cam shared with me was, what does one do if a child athlete is overweight? Do we speak to the parent, the coach, the teacher, the nurse? And what is one way we might be able to minimize a weight management problem long term? And the answer to that question has to do with portion size that I'm going to kind of put some relationship. Well, let me just put it this way. The food that comes into the house is the responsibility of the person who has the pocketbook or the finances to bring it. So if a parent is bringing food into the house, that's their responsibility because they make the money and can bring the food in the house, whereas the child's finances won't necessarily allow it, and now's not the time to do it. But the parent's responsibility of what food is in the house, when it's available, and how much is available will help the child decide how much they decide to eat. And that's the first step for weight management, meaning that if you buy 2 gallons of ice cream that's not portioned, the child's impulse would likely be to just eat as much as they can out of that gallon of ice cream. But if it's in a portion size that's just 1 serving, the child will more likely to have 1 serving and be done. So this is where we begin a weight management atmosphere whereby the food environment at home communicates without words a normal portion size and a healthy eating environment. So moving forward, we want to buy the foods that is going to be whole grains, fruits, and vegetables predominantly. And we want the processed foods, as we see in the handout that Cam sent to everybody today. We want processed foods really stored for a rainy day if you're really stuck, but the whole foods and the foods that one has to prep to be front and center. So this is a great opportunity for children to learn how to cook and for family members to learn how to cook and to have fun with it and to make mistakes. And if you remember one of the earlier slides, which I'll get back to really quickly, when one cooks, I should have had one on how many calories you burn doing the dishes, but it's no different really than cooking, where for 30 minutes of cooking, you're actually burning non-exercise heat energy. And the cooking process and the energy you that put into it actually enhances the enjoyment of the result. So this is an instinctive, great weight management routine that one has to get into when we're sheltering in place and cooking. Okay, so we want to follow safe food handling practices. And for athletes, we don't have to go light on the salt. And this is really general recommendations, but ideally in cooking, we will always use less salt, less sugar, and less fat than what we eat out. So there was a chef that once said, if you make the food at home versus eat that food out in a restaurant, you will save yourself 3 hours on the treadmill, meaning the food in the restaurant actually is going to be that much more calorically dense because of the added sugar, fat, and salt to enhance flavor than if you made that same meal at home. Okay, if we're making food from scratch, it's going to have fiber, and we want to minimize alcohol, which is definitely a problem in what I'm reading today. I think when we're sheltered in place, alcohol becomes the fun entertainment. My nephew actually sells wine and alcohol to restaurants in Manhattan and to liquor stores. And he thought he'd be out of a job. But the liquor store wine and alcohol is coming off the shelf, so he's fine. But that tells us that our alcohol activity has increased at home. And the disadvantage is that it actually will increase, it's disinhibiting, and it allows us to eat more and stop by the refrigerator more and munch more without discerning. So that's just one kind of caution. So
Karen, I have to jump in there because that
Okay.
alcohol topic is very depressing to me. But yes, common sense. And that's what my grandmother would tell me as well. And probably my mother and anyone else around. Can we change the topic quickly to caffeine? What about caffeine? How should we be treating caffeine during these periods?
Caffeine is a known ergogenic aid, a sports performance enhancer. And I think the quantity is what is established here is way too much. You don't want to be drinking coffee all day and getting the jitters and not being able to sleep at night. But I am big on promoting caffeine intake in coffee and teas, at least until noon. Did that answer your question?
Absolutely. Yep. Thank you.
Oh, okay. So then I just had some quick other recommendations to help support what Jan is saying here in this slide. He also mentions about staying hydrated, and the next slide kind of gives some guidelines for that. One of the things when we're staying home in place more, we don't really realize how thirsty we get because our sweat rate is not obvious and we're just staying in place. One of the big recommendations for all humans, including athletes, is to make sure when you get up in the morning to drink at least 8 to 16 ounces of fluid or water, depending upon body size. This helps us kind of cue into a hydration first time at the beginning part of our day. We have the least hydration once we wake up in the morning because we lose so much fluid just in the breath. So when we wake up in the morning, our stomachs are empty, our hydration is down, and before we even have that first cup of coffee, if that's your pleasure, we really want you to get into the habit of trying to drink 8 to 16 ounces of fluid. So you get up, you go to the bathroom, you brush your teeth, and you guzzle at least 8 ounces. And then here are just some other guidelines that don't have to be held fast to, but that morning fluid really does help you cue into your thirst better throughout the day. So here is just some suggestions to have 8 ounces of water with a meal, have the sports nutrition guidelines, which is about 8 to 12 ounces of fluid an hour before training. And for sure, depending upon sweat rate, we want 8 to 24 ounces of fluid during training. And post-training, again, replenish loss for about 16 to 24 ounces. And there's some cues to help us understand if we're thirsty or not before we even know we're thirsty, which is depicted in this next slide. These are the 3 foods humans tend to instinctively go to when we're thirsty. Because ice cream is cold and wet, the first thing we go to on the hot day of the year before we even drink water is usually ice cream. And we think that quenches the thirst in our mouth because it's, as we said, cold and wet. And it's only later that we realize we're thirsty. Also, ironically, you'd think that we wouldn't go to salty chips when we're thirsty, but because it changes the texture of our mouth, we think we're quenching a thirst before we know we're thirsty. And chocolate, because chocolate stays on our tongue and in our mouth longer than most other foods, it makes our mouth water more. And therefore, we think we're quenching thirst. So oftentimes, chocolate is a food we go to, or any kind of sweet or sweet and sour foods that make our mouth water are foods we tend to go to when we're thirsty. So if and when you're craving any of these foods, I'm highly recommending getting into the habit of drinking at least 8 ounces of water with it, before it, or certainly after, so you don't keep going with the food instead of the thirst need. And once you're hydrated and you still crave these foods, go for it. But the hydration factor can really affect how much we consume of these foods. Cam, did you have something to say over there?
More bad news, but it's very logical. It makes a lot of sense. I love my chocolate. I love my chips, but you're right. A good glass of water will, it's common sense, but yes, good to know. Thank you.
Okay, I think the other part of it too for athletes, and I can get back to that earlier slide, a lot of times when we see the volume of what athletes really need to consume, as we showed earlier, it's really impossible to get that volume in a normal, 3 to 4 hour training day. And therefore, those blenderized foods and smoothies are required, and sometimes it's still not enough. And that's when we will crave ice cream and chips and chocolate. And sometimes those are the foods we really do need to help replenish the fuel burned. I'm hoping during COVID that we can kind of have a little bit more time to eat whole foods, just to get in the habit of including that in our diets as well. Okay, so in summary, and we can go back to some of these other slides and questions as it comes up, but in summary, food, and this is actually taken from a restaurant in the East Village of Manhattan. They use this as a glass, I don't know, what is that called? A glass holder? You put your wine glass on, whatever it's called. And basically it says, food, buy it with thought, cook it with care, serve just enough, save what will keep, eat what will spoil, and homegrown is best. And try not to waste it. And Cam, since you've got that acre of land, I'm dying to hear what you've got homegrown.
I'm just staring at my orange tree right now thinking, oh yeah, I better pull some of those off before the squirrels or the whoever else gets to them before me. But Karen, really, really great stuff here. There are a bunch of questions that were submitted earlier, and why don't we start off with those. But if folks have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat function to start off with, and we'll just see how we go. A few people, Karen, have asked for these slides, and I'm not sure if you want to, we might put them in a PDF and share them with everybody, but
Sure.
A lot of really good information here. One of the interesting things with this group that's on the call, we've got probably a fair split between high school and collegiate level involvement, I'll call it that. Some are coaches, many are either administrators or support staff. Looks like we probably have some dietitian and nutritionists on the line. But the question is, with this change in activity, I won't call it less activity, how important is recovery in this new normal that we're experiencing?
Well, that's a really good question. Since I've worked with football for so many years, the recovery issue was important post-game and the next day. But because they had a week till next game and the way their training schedule worked, the absolute recovery was a little less important than if you're training 4 hours every single day. So it really just depends. Like if you have enough time in between games or in between the next practice, a lot of the recovery happens as you're staying at home. And, the other thing I was thinking about the other day, and one of the former football players, I don't know if you know, Nick Hardwick actually mentioned this, when after the Players Association came on and kind of changed the hours of how much football players were allowed to train in the course of the day in uniform or not. Before that, those guidelines were put into place. Football athletes would they would train, they would lift, they would actually have throughout their day a lot of time in between lifting so they can get the large muscle groups and the small muscle groups. And in doing so, having that whole day of training without it being intensified all at once, it allowed for a lot of recovery and allowed for more of a range of muscle strength. So injury potentially could be less when they actually play in games. So I'm kind of putting that out as a blueprint, because if we now have more time to recover at home, the need for intense recovery as we do in our everyday life is somewhat turned down. Mm-hmm. So the guidelines for recovery are pretty specific. We want about 1.5 grams of carbs per kilogram of body weight. So if I'm a 60 kilogram athlete, I need about 90 grams of carbs. And what is that equivalent to? Well, it's equivalent to, let's go back to that slide before. And I did have a slide up here in terms of what equivalence might be. But if we look at each serving of fruit being 15 grams of carbs and each serving of grain being 12, we can see that we're looking at a couple of sandwiches to replenish, or at least 2 pieces of bread providing 30 grams, mm-hmm. and 2 fruits, another 30. And then we need a glass of milk or yogurt with that to get closer to what we need in the 90 gram frame. So that's the recommendation, post-training, and ideally within the first 30 minutes to get that meal. And if you can't get the meal, that's when you want your liquid calories in your milk or your chocolate milk, where you've got some protein and some milk carbs, meaning the lactose plus the sugar in the chocolate.
Really, that's really, really good stuff, Karen. One question that, and it's probably more of an observation, we talked about it beforehand, just in terms of time. I think a lot of us are feeling like we probably should have more time than we ought to, but the days are sort of just, they're taking forever to get through, and all of a sudden another week has gone by. And for many of us, sort of 4 to 5 weeks now in this lockdown mode. How are you sort of working with athletes and those that are supporting athletes to develop a routine that is clearly very different to where we ended up, 3 or 4 or 5 weeks ago, so that there is time? Because a lot of what you're talking about is being thoughtful about your preparation, being thoughtful about the foods that you're buying. How do you recommend people that are feeling like they don't have the time right now and they're actually busier than ever?
I feel like that. So when you say that, when you don't have the time, I think that's when you go back to how we normally consume food, in the concentrated formats, in the smoothie format, in the liquid calories, and in the quicker meals. And there's a place for that. And I don't want to discourage consuming these foods, but I think kind of finding that happy medium for athletes now is a good opportunity. And I really like the idea, and I keep pushing it, is for those of you who don't have cooking skills to really try cooking a grilled cheese sandwich or eggs or the pasta meal. And really simple, even if you don't have time, how can you do it quickly? My big thing, I asked Cam earlier if I could do a food demonstration, but it didn't seem like the graphics here would make a whole lot of sense. But one of my favorite go-to foods is to zap a whole zucchini, now that they're in season, in the microwave for sliced first for a minute, and add that into a quesadilla. And it's kind of a unique way of doing it, but it's quick, it's fast, it's easy, and quesadillas really take 2 minutes to make. I don't know if that answered your question. But... Yep.
Yeah, no, for sure. Because I think it is a combination of things. It's preparation, but it's also using more than just common sense, but figuring out what works and sticking with it. And I think a lot of the athletes that I've come in contact with have been sort of transported. Many are sort of ramping up for a competitive season, and now having to think back, okay, it's a different phase of training. And so making that adjustment can't happen overnight. And another good question, just in terms of how about things to do to boost your immune system? Obviously there's a sensitivity now to not wanting to get sick, and we're limited with contact with obviously other people. But what are some recommendations for boosting your immune system?
Well, I think, we try to allude to that a little bit earlier, but really the boost in immune system really comes from eating those whole foods. And as we mentioned before, the phytochemicals and the antioxidants that are often lost in the processing are there in the whole food format. And if we really can get used to going to your orange tree, Cam, and pulling some of those oranges out, which is again more incidental activity, and peeling and chewing 6 or 7 oranges, which we normally sitting in front of us, who's going to sit down and peel 6 or 7 oranges and call it a meal? But if you're out there picking the oranges and you're out there for several hours, you're going to be eating a lot of them, and you won't think twice that you had 7 in an hour or so. So in a way, I'm kind of pushing that headset. This is a time where, yeah, your immunity is going to absolutely be enhanced if you get that whole food.
Mm-hmm. What about supplements when it comes to immune and just generally, what perspective do you have on supplements as a form of just general diet?
Well, that's a really good question, and I often answer that with probably too large an answer, but a supplement is meant to be a supplement to supplement food if you're not able to eat the whole food. And ideally, we're trying to shift to the whole food. And the problem with supplements, and I think I've been in this profession for long enough, and for those of you who are also been around for several decades in the profession, it's almost like as soon as you get one supplement that's just the super supplement, we find it interferes with another vitamin or mineral, and it ends up not being healthful, like vitamin A, for example, can increase risk for lung cancer. And it can get kooky after a while. So I tend to stay away from supplements unless it's one of those multivitamin and minerals. And if you know you're low in a certain nutrient, someone who might be lactose intolerant and not getting fortified other products, milk products or non-milk products, people with allergies, people with celiac, for example, might not absorb certain nutrients and need supplements as a result.
Mm-hmm. What about the keto diet? A lot of the latest and greatest is around the keto approach to fueling and refueling and weight loss. What's your perspective on that one?
Wow, I love the keto diet for the winter. What's my perspective? It's really interesting. It's quite fascinating, the research that's come out on that. I mean, really for athletes or endurance athletes who's training really more than an hour a day at high intensity level, there's been no advantage seen in the literature to date. In other words, the idea of keto diets and using more fat as fuel in the energy system in high intensity sport has not been shown to be effective in any study, unless you've read something in the last week or two. Yeah. That said, for weight management, there is this idea of metabolic shifting or switching that the more lay population have been engaged in, whereby if you're fasting through the night because you're sleeping and all the glycogen stores in your liver have been dissipated, and you get up in the morning and start training and not eat, meaning, an exercise class of sort or taking a walk or a jog. At that point, there's this metabolic shift where you're getting somewhat ketotic, not in the true sense. And that metabolic shifting seems to have some immune effect in some populations. And that doesn't say that you're on the keto diet, but you are doing this metabolic shifting during that night fast, exercise in the morning, and then consume your natural diet, which includes whole grains, fruits, vegetables, and carbohydrates. So that's one potential advantage for immunity. I mentioned I really like the keto diet for winter months because I think humans, if we look at our hunter and gatherer ancestors over the last 2+ million years, during the winter, that's what we physiologically consumed in most parts of the world, where we had mostly meat because nothing really grew. And I think our bodies are well adapted for a keto diet, but for long-term throughout the year, I don't see a place for that because you miss some major nutrients. And in the spring, summer, and fall, when fruits and vegetables and whole grains are more abundant, you want to take advantage of the antioxidant immune function of those foods. So for anybody wanting to embark on a keto diet, I would always say, you know, keep it to the winter months. And now that we're hitting spring, I would probably go more fruits, vegetables, and whole grains.
Okay. And you touched on it a little bit, but do you want to just talk a little bit more about, you know, the different versions of fasting, you know, everything from the 16 to 8 intermittent fasting through to days on, and what advice do you have for athletes that feel that is an approach that could improve their performance?
Well, I think the intermittent fasting makes the most sense for athlete performance as well, because you're not overly depleted, whereas days on end you are, and the over depletion decreases can affect training, and then training output is compromised. So I think the actual intermittent fasting on a daily basis of what we alluded to earlier, whereby, and this happens naturally in the athlete world anyway, where, you know, you have a training scheduled for 8 a.m. and you overslept and you just grab your glass of water, run out the door. So you're training in a fasting state. And that's intermittent fasting. It just has a fancy name. And I think this regularly happens in sport. And the same thing happens where you get up, you miss breakfast, you come back, you replenish. But, you know, just for that one meal, but then several hours go by because you're busy working, and then you do your second practice again in a depleted state. So that's an intermittent fasting state that could potentially have advantage for athletes, but I would use it in a periodized way, whereby that is, say, 3 months of the training cycle that you do these different types of interventions. But really, when you have the greatest demand for training to enhance performance, where the endurance and intensity is required, I don't recommend it as well. So that, you know, if you're periodizing the training during those longer events where you are depending on your training to enhance your performance, I would probably super fuel.
One question about resources, because I know this is one area that the more you research, the more you can find yourself going round and round in circles. And I think the book, How the Food Revolution Has Transformed Our Lives, that you mentioned, is such it's such a great example of a lot of what you're saying is do what you know. And even for those folks that know what they need to do, they don't necessarily do it. Do you have any other resources or websites or books that you sort of would either you go to yourself, or you'd recommend a really principles-based, evidence-based refresh or reset, so to speak, to go to that really ground you? Because like I said, there's so much stuff that gets thrown at us all the time that can often be very confusing.
You know, one of the resources I use, besides those infographics, which they still come at us pretty quickly,
Yep.
but I use a lot of Nancy Clark's work.
Okay.
What's the name of her book? I always forget, because the first one was after the New York City Marathon that we both ran. I almost think it was the New York City Marathon book, but Nancy Clark's book, and her postings are always right on, and they're really kind of take all this information and put it in like almost a one-page format of like, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Right. Is she at Simmons College? I'm just doing a quick scan.
She's
Sports
out of
Nutrition
Boston.
Guidebook.
That's
Okay.
it.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. And she's been around for many, many years, and really has, and one of her skills is going to every conference on nutrition and exercise and sport performance, and integrate all the information she gets. You know, we all have different skills. That's one of the ones I think she's done. She's served us well in communicating in her book and in her blogs and in her tweet account.
So I see there's one book that she's written that seems, it's a little bit, it goes back a little bit, but I think it's Nancy Clark's Sports Nutrition Guidebook is the one that's the first one that comes up. So to someone that asks.
And she had several editions since.
Right. Great. Anything else, Karen, that you think? I think we've covered a lot of really, really helpful stuff. And maybe one last opportunity if anyone else has questions before we wrap this up. But Karen, anything else that you wanted to? I thought that last little slide was a great reminder of just how to keep it very simple, and do what makes sense.
Well, thank you all for your time, and be safe.
Well, very good. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, Karen, again, and appreciate everyone your time. I know one thing's for sure with the meetings on the hour, that all these meetings that run up to the end of the next hour, you sort of have to rush off to the next meeting. So maybe everyone has about 10 or 15 minutes to rush off and grab a glass of water before whatever you have to do next, or more than anything else, appreciate everyone's time. Karen, thanks again, and look forward to talking to you all next time. So thank you.
Thank you. Stay safe all.
All right.